If you've been playing a game long enough, very often you'll develop a new vocabulary in the context of when you're playing that game. Obviously, every single sport or hobby or game is going to be a little bit different, but what I think is always really interesting to sort of take note of is when you're into something a lot, like you're playing it every week or you're playing it every month for years perhaps, and suddenly the words that you used to know in real life get translated into the context of whatever game you're used to, even when you're not playing that game. Obviously, when you're at a tournament for something, you're going to be using words in the game's context, but what I think is really funny is when you start thinking of that game and the vocabulary that comes along with that game when you hear certain words in real life. In today's video, we're going to take some of your suggestions from Twitter, as well as some examples from my own life, where certain words that I've heard throughout my years playing Yu-Gi-Oh! When translated into real life, suddenly I can't think of anything besides Yu-Gi-Oh! Or whatever context it has within this card game. For example, whenever I hear someone say, or whenever I get an ad to fix a deck or build a deck, I'm not thinking of the wooden structure that you put in the back of your house. I'm thinking of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategy. Now, how often do I hear fix a deck or build a deck in my real life? Not too often. However, and back in like a couple years ago, at my start of college, I actually worked at a hardware store, so pretty frequently I would hear people asking for advice for building decks, and I always thought that was kind of funny because I'm just like, well, they don't want advice on their Machina Fortress strategy. They're probably asking for that attachment that they put on the back of their house, and that's sort of just one example of words that me personally, I can't hear without putting in a Yu-Gi-Oh! Context. The next example is actually super helpful if you're trying to write papers for classes, and that's whenever I hear effect, I think of Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Effects, not the effect that starts with an A. Now, what's educational about this, and I know this is going to be kind of lame, but I'm an English major, so I like this kind of thing, but whenever you're writing a paper and you're trying to decide between effect with an E and affect with an A, you sort of have to ask yourself, well, which one is used in which situation? Well, the situations are actually pretty straightforward, especially if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player. What I mean by that is that effect with an E is going to be a noun in most cases, and an effect with an A is going to be a verb. Now, if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, you can use this knowledge to help you out when you're writing papers instead of having to look it up, because the thing that you're reading, it's an effect of a monster. It's not affecting the monster. Now, what's interesting, I guess what sort of comes up here, is that if you also look at Yu-Gi-Oh! Card effects where monsters are unaffected by things, you'll notice that it says unaffected with an A, because in those cases, it's using it as a verb. Who knew that Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards could actually help you out writing college papers? As per Google, a meta-analysis is the statistical procedure for combining data from multiple studies, and this is something that you sort of come across when you're in classes. You hear of meta-analysis, but when I hear that word, I don't really think of that sort of situation. I'm thinking of what's the best possible analysis. What's the meta deck version of this analysis, which is totally incorrect, by the way. And actually, in some cases, I've sort of talked about meta in videos, not necessarily in the way of like meta decks, but in the form of meta-analysis, and oftentimes it's very confusing, and sometimes I even edit those parts out just because when I go back, it's like, okay, are viewers actually going to know that I'm trying to do a meta-analysis on something, or are they going to think that I'm talking about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagame? It's kind of funny that metagame gets reduced to meta, and I know some people think that meta in a card game sense or any game sense refers to the acronym most effective tactic available. I think mostly this is just BS. I don't actually think that's what most people are thinking of when they hear the word meta. I think it's just a shortened version of metagaming, but whatever it means, I know what context people talk about when they say meta in a gaming world. They're just talking about whatever the best deck or the best strategy is available for that time. So when you're in class, you might hear your teacher say something like, we're going to do a meta-analysis today, and you might be thinking back to the pie charts that you see on Simo's channel, not so much what they're doing in that class. This next one is kind of funny, but basically whenever I talk to someone new, and I'm not really a big person with sharing that I play Yu-Gi-Oh! As like my opening line when I meet someone for the first time, but sometimes when you're talking to someone about hobbies, they'll say something like, oh, I play a lot of card games in my spare time, and automatically I'm thinking, okay, what do you play? Do you play Yu-Gi-Oh? Do you play Magic? Do you play Pokemon? Do you play Hearthstone? But a lot of times, actually more often than not, they're not talking about those types of card games, not trading card games. They're just talking about things like poker or Uno or something along those lines, and that's something that always sort of trips me up whenever I meet someone new and we're talking about hobbies. I don't know about you guys, maybe I'm a little bit biased here because I have blue eyes, but just the term blue eyes is sort of ruined for me, right? Because when I hear blue eyes, I'm thinking of Blue Eyes White Dragon. And one of the situations that this has come up, obviously this must be pretty popular because there's a bunch of memes about it, but basically a lot of high school girls, I remember when I was back in high school, used to share these sort of pictures as well. They're just pictures of some like kid that's like high school age and he has blue eyes, and it'll say just over top of it, boys with blue eyes. And this is very popular, I say, because there are a ton of memes where people have that picture at the top and then a person with a Blue Eyes White Dragon on the bottom. I think those are hilarious examples of just kind of showing that people that know of Blue Eyes White Dragon, people that have heard of Yu-Gi-Oh, very often can't hear the words blue eyes without thinking of the Blue Eyes White Dragon or Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon or Blue Eyes Chaos Max Dragon. Anything with blue eyes to me seems like Blue Eyes White Dragon. Destiny Hero Malicious came out when I was in middle school and I didn't really know what the word meant. I remember coming home and reading on metagame.com all the different decks that were using and abusing Destiny Hero Malicious, and I thought, well, that's a very cool word, but what does it mean? So I googled it and found out that it kind of meant like evil or something along those lines, and suddenly, and I'm not kidding, this is pretty embarrassing, but in pretty much every single situation that I possibly could fit the word malicious in, I constantly used the word malicious. It was in all of my essays, all of my stories, anything that I could possibly use the word malicious, I was sort of flexing my word knowledge by putting it in there. Little did my teachers know that I only knew that word because of Yu-Gi-Oh! A more modern example of this, and once again, it's kind of embarrassing, but in many of my college essays, so this is not that long ago, just a couple of years, I very often use the word dichotomy, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I learned that word originally from Pot of Dichotomy. That card is a little bit older. I didn't really use that word so much when I was in high school, but as soon as I got to college, I suddenly just, I mean, you need to write more words, right? When you're trying to actually meet that sort of paper mark, you need to have different ways of explaining things. You can't just saying like different over and over and over again. So very often I would slip in just one dichotomy word, and once again, just like in the case of Destiny Hero Malicious, the only reason I knew the word dichotomy was because of Pot of Dichotomy. What's funny though is that even though I started using the word dichotomy because I was thinking of Pot of Dichotomy, the Yu-Gi-Oh spell card, as the semester went on and as I stayed in college year after year after year, I started noticing that it wasn't just me using that word, unlike in the case of malicious where no one else is really using that word. Even throughout college, malicious is not a very popular word. It's sort of a weird word that people don't really use unless they know Destiny heroes. Obviously it's a word outside of the whatever. But anyway, I use dichotomy in many situations because of the card. However, I also noticed that many teachers, many professors, and many other students would use the word dichotomy. It was either in the lessons or in their essays. So that word isn't as out there as Destiny Hero Malicious's name was. So suddenly it became not so much me using dichotomy because of the Yu-Gi-Oh card, but more so just me hearing the word dichotomy and then relating it back to the Yu-Gi-Oh card in my own head. And then lastly, one of the original words that made me want to do this video, and also a word that seemed very popular when you guys commented on my tweet a couple days ago, duel. And duel can be used in a few different ways in the real world. You have the duel, the same version that you see in Yu-Gi-Oh spelled with E instead of A, but then also you have that A version when you're holding two different things. And here's the deal, duel is all over the place, and not necessarily in a Yu-Gi-Oh context. You have dual wielding in a lot of different video games, and every time I see that, I'm just like, well, I'm thinking of like Yu-Gi-Oh dueling, but perhaps the more confusing aspect are when people are just talking about like duel in the same spelling as Yu-Gi-Oh uses, but in a slightly different context. I think of Mario Party, you have those duel spaces where you and one opponent sort of 1v1 each other for some like abilities like stars or coins, something along those lines. And whenever I see that in any game or just in real life, I always think of Yu-Gi-Oh dueling, not whatever context I'm supposed to be thinking it is. I think that's sort of along the same lines as deck from the very beginning of this video. Duel and deck are just so popular in Yu-Gi-Oh and also outside of Yu-Gi-Oh that it seems like those are the ones that I come across the most often. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on all these words that Yu-Gi-Oh has quote-unquote ruined. Please let me know in the comment section below what are some other words that I missed. I try to take the most popular answers from Twitter, but obviously I couldn't take everything and put them in this one video, so let me know in the comments what are some words that when you hear them you can't help but think about about this card game that we all love and play, or maybe there's some other context where there's some words that I wasn't even thinking of in any realm. Maybe it's a card name. I didn't really talk about card names in this video outside of malicious and dichotomy, but there are a lot of adjectives in Yu-Gi-Oh cards. When you see those outside of Yu-Gi-Oh, it can be a little bit jarring at first. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.